When the spooks are having a midnight jamboree.
Hello and welcome back to Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics, where we're taking the Walt Disney Animated Classics and filtering them down to the superior Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics. Why Waly Gisnep? Well, because if you're a 4-year-old reading Walt Disney's signature, that's what you're going to read. As always, I am Liam, and I am once again joined by my friend Ben. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Liam. What are we looking at this week?
This week, I'm very excited to say that we are on our final pair of package films, specifically Fun and Fancy Free and The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. Once again, we drew lots on these, and going into this, I was thinking, it's not too bad. I think both of these are okay, so neither of us have much to worry about. Now, I'm not sure how you're feeling, but I definitely feel that I got the short straw this time.
Without going into too much detail straight away, I got filmic adaptations of two literary classics, and Liam got what can only be described as a live-action horror show.
As you may have guessed from that, I was watching Fun and Fancy Free, and Ben, you took The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad.
Indeed I did. So before we launch into discussing the first of these, Liam, going into these films, did you have any recollections of watching any of these in your youth, or any other memories prior to this?
I first sat down to watch these earlier in the year, and I didn't recall ever seeing anything from these films before. These are the closest to proper films that we have amongst the package films, because what they are is they're both double features consisting of two shorter films, about 30 minutes each. So really what we're looking at is maybe 4 short animated films with a little bit of framing device sort of to dress them up.
Reading into the production of these films, Walt Disney Studios couldn't really decide how they wanted to pair them up. There were various other adaptations and longer cartoons that weren't quite feature length that they were working on. Some of them got cut down, or some of them were expanded. Again, during the mid-40s, productions like Lady and the Tramp were put on hold, and emphasis put on producing these. I don't think there's a direct quote, but when Walt Disney first saw the adaptation of Wind in the Willows, he said it wasn't good enough to be a full-length feature.
Did he think it was good enough to go in a double feature?
It would seem so.
We'll just have to agree to disagree with Walt there.
Let's start then with the film that came first chronologically, and that is Fun and Fancy Free. Liam, how does it start?
This film starts with a framing device that I quite like. We see Jiminy Cricket floating down a river singing the opening number. My first reaction is, has he abandoned Pinocchio?
Well, I guess at the end of the film, Pinocchio doesn't need him anymore. Although, at the end of Pinocchio, he does get a badge saying he's officially a conscience, which implies that Pinocchio hasn't developed an internalized one. I guess it could be before the events of Pinocchio, or long after Pinocchio has died, because we've established Jiminy Cricket's lifespan is at best ambiguous.
If it is before Pinocchio, he is wearing nice clothes, so it was before he fell on the hard times that he was facing at the start of Pinocchio.
I mean, maybe this was set in the 20s, and Pinocchio was after the Depression of the 30s. Who knows?
There is a prequel film I'm looking forward to, which is about the fall of Jiminy Cricket.
Stop giving us live-action versions of Hercules. We want to know how Jiminy Cricket started.
So we've got Jiminy Cricket. Once again, he breaks into someone's house, and he's sort of going through the person's stuff, and he sees the papers, and he complains that the papers are always scaremongering about how the world is going to end and that everything is terrible. To be fair, mate, we have just come out of World War II.
The world has literally just invented and used the atomic bomb. It's justified to be terrified.
They're about to face 40 years of just abject terror, never knowing if you're going to wake up in the morning. And Jiminy Cricket is just there going, just live with it. Whatever will be, will be.
An excellent message.
So Jiminy decides to go around the house and he wants to cheer everyone up. And to do so, he tells us the story of Bongo, a circus bear.
Again, it speaks volumes of Jiminy's strange attitude to cheering people up. That he wants to tell a story about an animal that was almost certainly kept in appalling conditions and abused.
Not even almost certainly, it's actually explicitly stated in the film. We're introduced to Bongo, who is the star of the circus, but then we're told that his life was miserable and he was in a gilded cage.
But hang on, a gilded cage is one where you're living a life of luxury but you don't have freedom. Isn't Bongo just in a normal cage?
Yeah, he's just in a normal cage and thrown about and forced to perform circus acts.
Now, the character of Bongo, how would you describe him for someone who's never seen this film?
Well, his main mode of transportation is a unicycle, which I hate.
You hate that he uses one, or you hate unicycles in general?
I hate anyone whose main mode of transportation is the unicycle. So immediately, not off to a great start with Bongo. Yeah, I feel sad for him. He's a prisoner. But very quickly, he escapes and gets to live in the wild. He's rubbish at it, obviously. He's never lived in the wild, so suddenly he has to fend for himself. He still decides to keep his clothes on, though. None of the other bears have clothes, but he's like, no, I'm keeping these.
Does he keep the unicycle?
Oh yeah, this is what I mean. Throughout the whole sequence, he rides about on his unicycle at several points. Now,
it's my understanding that unicycles are quite hard to ride, but I suspect they're a lot harder in the forests of America. There's a reason bears don't do it in nature.
There's not too much really going on with this story. It's a bit heavy-handed with the whole circuses are bad. We know. I don't have a circus. I don't know why you're trying to get me to feel this way, Disney.
Maybe it was a more common problem back then. Maybe like 1 in 10 people had a circus.
And the story just sort of follows Bongo adjusting to life in the woods. There is one sequence in it that I really like, which is his first night. He's very happy, he's enjoying his freedom. He tries to sleep, and the forest is just incredibly noisy. And they manage to land a decent joke here. It turns out that all of the noise is just coming from really violent, tiny insects. And it will just zoom in on them and you'll just see this very nasty looking slug eating very loudly. And that's what's keeping Bongo awake. That's the only joke that lands in the whole thing, by the way.
So enjoy it. And if you're sat there thinking, that's not funny, yep, that's the best you get.
Do you remember where the story goes next?
So, for context, I watched this film maybe 5 years ago and I haven't watched it since, so I can remember what Bongo looks like and the vague gist of the film. Does he meet a lady bear?
He meets a lady bear, and the rest of the film is him just flirting with a lady bear, and then eventually a big scary bear comes along, and he wants the lady bear, even though he's 5 times the size of her, and I'm like, I'm not sure how bears age, but I think this might be a very young lady bear, and I'm not comfortable with this.
Of all the criticisms I thought you might make of Bongo the bear, I did not think one of them would be uncomfortable age implications.
So it's basically just a kind of love rivalry, but something really bizarre happens. There's a whole musical sequence about the way that bears say they love each other is by slapping. Is this ringing any bells?
It's difficult to convey through the use of audio what my expression was there, which is why Liam was laughing. I very vaguely remember this. Just for context, don't slap a bear.
If there's one takeaway from this whole film, it's that I can recommend watching this segment. It's called A Bear Likes to Say It With a Slap, I believe.
That rings a bell.
It's a proper earworm. I've had it stuck in my head all day since listening to it. But I've looked this up and this doesn't happen in nature. This isn't something bears do. This is something an animator decided, let's do a sequence in which bears slap each other to say they love each other.
I think it's important to remember that Disney Studios, admittedly not their animation branch, are the progenitors of the lemmings jump off cliffs urban myth. Because when they were filming a nature documentary on lemmings, they decided they weren't very interesting, so made this thing up, and there's footage of lemmings being thrown off a cliff because the people filming it decided that was the most entertaining thing to do with them. So drawing some bears that slap each other I don't think is outside of the realms of possibility for Disney.
If I had to guess, this is one of those situations where Walt Disney is kind of covering his back in his real life troubles.
How do you mean?
Basically, I'm worried that he has a partner that he accidentally slapped and he's made a whole animated film to excuse it away.
That's an exceptionally dark reading of this. Are you in some way suggesting that Walt Disney was using animated animals to normalise his own horrific behaviour?
Yes.
I just want to state for the record, we're not implying that Walt Disney did that in any way. But it's got to have come from somewhere.
I might leave this whole bit out.
We might cut that out. Yeah, maybe.
So all the bears slap each other, and in the end, Bongo manages to chase away the big scary bear and can happily be with the female bear, and it's just very nothing. I don't blame you for not remembering too much of it, because I have to admit, my eyes glazed over during most of this.
Yeah, my main recollection of it is that there's not really much of a plot.
No, it's just a sort of very heavy-handed circus is a bad story that gets thrown away very quickly in favour of slapping people is good. good.
So they start with a very good moral message, but then take a sharp U-turn into a horrible one.
And the worst part is we've already had that moral message before with Dumbo. Basically, Bongo is just Dumbo again, but worse and without any of the emotional stakes.
I'd say it's Dumbo crossed with Bambi minus all the good bits.
And minus Thumper.
Look, we're not going back to Thumper. Let's talk about Mickey and the Beanstalk then.
Well, before we get to Mickey and the Beanstalk, we cut back to Jiminy, who's satisfied that this lovely little story is enough to ease the anxiety of impending nuclear holocaust. And he goes back to rummaging around the person's house, and he sees a letter that's been opened, and he's like, oh, it's not very becoming to read someone else's mail. However, and then proceeds to do it. Really have to stress this, but Jiminy is consistently showing bad moral character, and is frankly the worst choice for a conscience.
I mean, on the one hand, certainly in the UK at the moment, it's illegal to open someone else's post. But if someone broke into my house and all they did was read my letters, I guess I'd be happy that that's all they did.
So he reads the letter and he sees that the person whose house he's in has been invited to a party across the street. And he decides that that's also an invitation that extends to him. So he decides to crash this party and it's like, well, I've already broken into one house tonight. May as well make it two.
Jiminy Cricket is that person who finds Facebook events and just, because they're open to the public, just says they're going and goes. So Liam, Jiminy goes to attend a nice fun party. What image greets him when he looks in?
This party consists of a grown man alongside the guest whose house Jiminy had previously broken into, revealed to be a little girl, and the man's two ventriloquist puppets. They're all wearing party hats and they're all eating cake.
Well, no, two of them aren't eating cake because they're dummies and they can't eat. I mean, if you've not seen this, I'd recommend Googling it, but I'm certain you don't want to. But they look as creepy as you think they do.
Quick aside, I think we all have to be really thankful for Jim Henson, who basically invented felt puppets and popularised them. Without him, we'd still be dealing with these horrifying ventriloquist puppets.
I'd never thought of it like that, but yes, thank you, Jim. Thank God. Now, aside from the natural horror of ventriloquist dummies, which fall very deeply into the uncanny valley, I think a party that's just a grown man and a girl of 7 or 8, would you say? Maybe a little bit older?
Around there, yeah.
Just the two of them, that's not right. If he was related to her, so he was an uncle or her parents were there, I wouldn't have a problem with it, but that's not the case.
The invite was explicitly for her. That's the invite that Jiminy found. She's the only guest, and then he's put his puppets there so that it doesn't feel as empty.
I mean, I guess she's an 8-year-old girl who lives by herself, so getting to spend time with an adult probably is some nice reprieve.
I hadn't thought of that. Really, the terrifying puppets are just the icing on this already very upsetting cake. And I can't emphasise this enough, this framing device comes out of nowhere. They establish a framing device at the start with Jiminy Cricket. He then breaks into someone else's house, and suddenly the framing device switches over to them. Just establish a framing device and stick to it. If you're doing a framing device for every feature in this package, what's the point in a framing device?
It would be like at the start of Tangled, where it's narrated by Flynn Rider and he says, "This is the story of how I died." And then halfway through the film, we're at a cookery contest that was happening in real life. That's how incongruous it is.
It does lead to another nice live-action animation merging, where Jiminy drinks a glass of lemonade, and once again, I've no idea how they did it, but it looks really impressive. This is a live-action glass of lemonade, by the way. It's not just an animator drawing Jiminy Cricket drinking lemonade, and me going, wow!
Now, to be fair to the filmmakers at this point, I believe the guy with the ventriloquist dummies was a famous / popular entertainer of the day.
Yeah, so this is Edgar Bergen, alongside his very popular characters Charlie and Mortimer. Not sure why they were popular, they're not particularly funny. In fact, on that note, I don't like narrators at the best of times. Like, if your story's going to have a narrator throughout, I'm not overly pleased with that. However, if your narrator is also a ventriloquist, it means they do the really annoying thing that ventriloquists do, which is to just say any line and then, in character, as one of their puppets, respond to it with a quip. And it happens every time the narrator speaks.
I mean, the thing is, Liam, this is a podcast and it's only 2 voices. For all they know.
Don't get me wrong, there are some I was going to say very good. There are some good ventriloquists out there. But I don't like the shtick of you have to have two characters at odds or they have to contrast each other too much. And it means that you always fall into the very, very simple straight man foil relationship. The problem with this is the straight man is literally just narrating a story and the foil just has to keep calling him out on it. And it's just like, just give it a rest, please, and just tell the story.
And what story is indirectly being told?
The story itself isn't bad. It's an adaptation of Jack and the Beanstalk starring Mickey, Donald and Goofy. Great trio. Anytime I see the three of them together, I'm generally pretty happy. And as an adaptation of Jack and the Beanstalk goes, it's pretty good. There's a lot to like. The Beanstalk growth sequence is really nice, and I would even say it's probably the standard for overnight Beanstalk growth sequences. That really popular genre.
This is where it all started.
It's just really good. There's lots of comedic beats in it. It matches with the music really well. It's just a nice animated sequence. Again, the whole story, really nice. Take out the narrator and remove it from the weird bongo film. I think you've got a really nice 25-minute film.
And I think that's the case with a lot of these, is they were chopped up and released in different formats or as part of different collections. Obviously, Disney throughout the years has had various TV programs and obviously a whole channel. It's the kind of thing that does get shown in a lot of different formats.
Yeah, I do want to go away and see if I can find a version which is just the story, doesn't have the creepy puppet narrator, and isn't attached to anything else. I think that'd be fine. Even so, my 4-year-old test, if I had a 4-year-old kid who loved just that, I'd be fine having to watch that every Saturday for 6 months. It's fine. It's got some nice sequences, and it's a solid adaptation of an already good story. One bit that I did enjoy is that the giant makes a sandwich out of a block of cheese, an entire leg of a turkey or chicken, and about 20 bulbs of garlic, I think?
He's a maniac.
I should say, they don't include the golden goose, but they do have the magical singing heart. They just sort of keep it to one MacGuffin. And it's said that the giant stole the harp because he just wanted someone to sing him to sleep.
How dare he? How dare he want to sleep?
And as someone who really struggles to sleep unless I'm watching someone with a soothing voice pretend to give me an eye exam, I'm fine with this.
Liam's talking about ASMR, if that's not clear.
So yeah, it's a nice little adaptation of Jack and the Beanstalk. And after it ends, it cuts back to the creepy party and the giant shows up trying to find the little mouse and everyone kind of faints and that's it. It's fine.
Yeah, I think it's one of the more watchable of the package films because it's only 2 narratives to hold on to, but I don't think it has the gloss or quality of one of the actual proper feature-length films.
The thing that annoys me the most is it could have been much more watchable if you had attached the weird ventriloquist party to the bongo film and the nice Jiminy breaking into someone's house to the Jack and the Beanstalk film, because I could just then fast forward through all of the bad stuff and then just watch all of the okay stuff. Instead, you either have an okay framing device with a bad story or a terrible framing device with an okay story.
So if anyone wants to do a fan edit of Fun and Fancy Free, that's Liam's recommendation.
So Ben, what about The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad? Were you disappointed that, unlike the title suggests, it wasn't a crossover film?
Well, genuinely, the first time I saw this film, I didn't realise what it was. I thought Ichabod and Mr. Toad were just 2 characters Disney had come up with. What it actually is an animated adaptation of first The Wind in the Willows and then The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. This also has a semi-contrived framing device. So it starts with Basil Rathbone seemingly just being himself. Basil Rathbone, of course, famous for playing Sherlock Holmes, pontificating on which is the greatest literary character.
Oh yeah, I forgot that this was the sort of the conceit of the framing device. And I believe it's Basil Rathbone representing English literature, and then it's thrown up against American literature represented by
Bing Crosby.
Oh yeah.
Who were both pretty big stars at the time.
Too big, you might say, to appear live action hosting a little party.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Reading on the production side of it, it seems that these were being made and they drafted in the celebrity voices to try and bring in a bit of attention because they were aware that the animation quality is fairly poor.
Yeah, from my memory, these are among the uglier of the early Disney films.
That's fair. But before we get to that, we have this live-action framing device, which is just a camera panning through a library. And Basil Rathbone tells us that he thinks the greatest literary character, or for him anyway, is Mr. Toad from The Wind in the Willows. And what follows is him narrating a very abridged version of that story.
I'm surprised he goes for Toad of Toad Hall. I would have assumed that Basil Rathbone would have said that Sherlock Holmes was the best literary character.
The question wasn't, who's the most lucrative character? Now, full disclosure, I'm not a big fan of Wind in the Willows. I've seen innumerable adaptations of it. It's not a story that really speaks to me, but also I'm aware it's a classic and means a lot to a lot of people.
I'm very much one of those people. I really like The Wind in the Willows, and generally, I like pretty much every adaptation of it.
Including this one?
Including this one. I think it's a solid enough adaptation. It doesn't deviate too much from the story, so it can't really go wrong. Again, looks a bit cheap, but they don't make any weird changes, so the story's all there.
Yeah, it's a relatively faithful adaptation. They change some stuff just to keep it streamlined, but for the most part, it's a faithful story. So we won't go through that in detail. There's some weird stuff in there.
Such as?
Well, right at the start, there were a couple of things that sprung out to me. One is, going through the credits, 6 different people were attributed to writing the story for this film. And I'm not including the authors of the 2 stories these are based on. Secondly, I'll just very quickly jump in with my favourite names in the opening credits. There were 2 this time. There was Iwerks and Thor Putman. Although last time I did this and said Art Babbitt as a hilarious name, I actually found out Art Babbitt was a legendary animator who actually created Goofy. So I feel a bit stupid for laughing at his name. For me, the weirdest part of this adaptation is it has humans in.
Yes, I remember the one image that seems to spring to mind is Toad being sentenced to jail by a human judge.
Yeah, so all the police officers and the postman and the judge are all humans. It's just weird. It's similar to what we discussed in Pinocchio with Honest John, where him and Gideon are animals, but they're kind of sort of human-sized animals and they have human proportions. Whereas in this, the animals are anthropomorphic, but they are the size of the animals they are, which is weird.
Yeah, Toad is at the hearing, and it is a human-sized courtroom, and he is a toad-sized toad being sentenced. I would have loved to have been on that jury.
And it passes over into their homes as well, so Toad Hall is far too big for Toad. Like, he doesn't even come up to the door handles, but it's far too small for a human. It's this weird middle ground.
So you're saying it's not big enough for it to have been built by a human who loved Toad so much that they left it to a toad?
Unless it was a very small human.
Or it was built by a human who was so obsessed with toads, they built a mansion for a toad, but not obsessed enough with toads to know what size the mansion should be.
They were obsessed with the idea of toads. Now, there's a few other weird things that stand out. I'll say this, Badger in this has the worst Scottish accent I've ever heard in anything.
I remember this.
I'm not exaggerating. Try doing a Scottish accent at home. I promise you yours is better than Badger's in this film. There's also a huge prevalence of guns in this film. The police officer that arrests Toad has the biggest gun pointed at his head when he does. And there's a lot of just random shooting. I think the worst part is towards the end when Toad and his allies are sneaking back into Toad Hall. They see one of the weasels patrolling the bridge and Toad goes to shoot him in cold blood, and it's only his allies grasping the gun away from him that stops him murdering someone before they have the chance to even be aware of what's going on.
I think that's straight from the original text, right? 6 pages of Toad preparing to murder someone.
No, you're thinking of Apocalypse Now and Heart of Darkness.
I often confuse those. Should Heart of Darkness have been thrown into the consideration for this film?
I certainly would have preferred the message, because Basil Rathbone says how much he adores Mr. Toad, and the ending is sort of, oh, Mr. Toad and his scrapes, because they finally get him out of this car mania, and then he ends up wanting to go into flying. But as someone who has a passionate hatred for the inequality that the aristocracy brings, Mr. Toad represents everything I hate about the UK social system.
This is part of why I love Wind in the Willows, though, is that it is such a scathing takedown of the aristocracy without intending to be. It's all unintentional. It's written, obviously, with a lot of love for the landed gentry, but they're horrible people.
Oh, for sure. Toad tries to kill people, he has no regard for others, and the moral of the story is you should risk your life to make sure the aristocracy can stay in their nice mansion. At one point, the villain, the bar owner called Winky, who, as a little cameo, is played by a guy called Ollie Wallace, who did the scores for Cinderella and Dumbo and a bunch of other Disney films. This is a nice little cameo for him. At one point, Winky the villain is trying to behead Moley, and I'm not just saying he throws something at him. Literally, his goons are holding him down on a block, and Winky is holding an axe above Moley's head. But yeah, it's a perfectly functional, but I'd say relatively charmless and clunky adaptation of Wind in the Willows.
I struggle as to whether I can call it charmless just because I find the story itself so charming. The problem is it's not the best adaptation, and I think you can definitely find a better way to experience the story. But, you know, for a 30-minute story that is accessible for kids, it's not bad. Again, a lot of violence, a lot of gunplay, a lot of potential beheadings, but it's okay.
My only other observation is there's a montage of newspaper headlines detailing Toad's fall from grace, and one of the other headlines you can see is, quote, "Lightning bolt kills 2, hurts several others." There was no need to put that in the film. Once Basil Rathbone has finished narrating this story, I was going to say he passes over to Bing Crosby, but Bing just sort of takes over of his own volition.
Typical Bing.
Typical Bing. And says that his favourite character is that of Ichabod Crane from The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Now, unlike the Wind in the Willows adaptation, which features narration and character voices, this is entirely voiced by Bing.
Do you think that was on his insistence?
There's a lot of bum singing going on in it. Now, again, I'm familiar with the story of Sleepy Hollow. I've never actually read the original text, but from what I gather, this is a pretty faithful adaptation. Some of the lines describing Ichabod are literal quotes from the book, which is quite nice, and it's often pointed to as a fairly faithful retelling of that story.
Generally, in adaptations of Sleepy Hollow, a lot gets lost or a lot gets changed because the story itself doesn't translate well into a good film narrative.
No, basically the first 20 minutes is not really a lot happening. It's basically just focusing on Ichabod. So literally the first thing we see Ichabod do is steal a pie. And he dedicates himself wholeheartedly to the theft of food. He's described by the narrator as conscientious, but literally his only purpose in life is to get free food off women.
And again, this is pretty much faithful.
Again, you're absolutely right, yeah. Like, that's how he's described in the book. He's also consistently described as thin, and I just think, how? All we see him do is eat. So, Ichabod goes around the town, harassing the women, stealing their food. They love it for some reason, I've no idea why. His main rival is a character called Brom Bones, who, if you've not seen this film, he's basically just a cut-price Gaston.
I was going to say, it's just Gaston.
He's a big lad who's quite stupid, but he's good at hunting. He thinks he's God's gift to women. He wears a red tunic type thing. He sings a song in the pub. Even though I know this came 50 years before Gaston, I still feel like this is the rip-off and Gaston's the original. And he gives alcohol to animals, which is just wrong.
I was about to say, he's not as terrible a person as Gaston, but that's pretty bad. He's never portrayed as malicious in any way, I don't believe.
No, he's a bit of a jerk and he's jealous, but he's never actively trying to kill anyone, which is quite a low compliment now I say it out loud.
It's a far stretch away from Toad and everyone murdering in that universe, though.
Oh, for sure. So we're introduced to the object of their shared affections, a woman called Katrina, who is meant to be the beauty of the village. And Ichabod is kind of thinking that way, but also, whenever he pictures himself with her, he thinks of inheriting her father's farm when he dies, and that being a gold mine.
Yeah, he's not a likeable character in any way, really.
No, he's cowardly, selfish, and manipulative, with no redeeming traits. If you've seen Johnny Depp in Tim Burton's one and go, oh, he's lovable, he's not in this, he's a jerk. When we're introduced to Katrina, Bing describes her in a way that I think is meant to be a compliment, but it doesn't scan very well nowadays, because he says, she's as plump as a partridge. I've never called a person plump as a partridge, and if I have, it's never been intended to be flattering. And the worst thing is, she's not. She's drawn like every Disney sex symbol of the time as a literal hourglass.
Yeah, there was definitely one animator at Disney whose specialty was just drawing sexy women. And for every film, they would just give him that one project, and no one wanted to interact with him outside of that.
I'm sure if they were alive today, they'd be very popular on Reddit.
It was a bit too early to have been Don Bluth, wasn't it?
That made me laugh. Don Bluth, for those who aren't aware, is the animator who made All Dogs Go to Heaven and Anastasia and a bunch of those films.
I like that when we're referring to Don Bluth in the context of drawing sexy women, the first film you decided to mention was All Dogs Go to Heaven.
Look, it was the first one that sprang to mind as it's my favourite. The sexiest woman he drew was the princess in Dragon's Lair, but no one's played Dragon's Lair, so I wasn't going to make the reference.
So we have our plump as a partridge, Katrina, and both Ichabod and knockoff Gaston are interested in her, I believe.
Yeah, and pretty much every other man in the village is after her. There's in fact a song about her playing hard to get, but it's not flattering to anyone involved. One of the lines is saying, you can do more with other women when compared to Katrina. I don't think anyone's coming off well with that analogy.
Wow!
I know!
That was probably improv by Bing.
And this goes on for a while, and eventually Katrina and her father host a party, which Ichabod is the cock of the ball at. He's dancing with her all night. He's helping himself to a lot of free food, far more than is socially acceptable. And whilst they're at this party, Brombones can see he's losing this game of courtship.
You've got to be pretty rubbish to be losing out as a romantic rival to Ichabod Crane.
I mean, neither of them have much in the way of personality, and what little personality they have is objectionable. I think Brom is as surprised as you are, to be honest, but then he remembers that Ichabod is famously cowardly. Even though we've had 20 minutes of nothing happening just focusing on Ichabod as a character, this hasn't been established at all. We just get told it. But when he remembers Ichabod's a coward, he decides to tell everyone the story of the Headless Horseman, and what follows is a genuinely quite good song. It's very jazzy, it's got a lot of clever lyrics in it, it very much suits Bing's musical stylings. It's genuinely a lot of fun.
I have fond memories of it. I also find it interesting that the thing that Sleepy Hollow is most famous for, the Headless Horseman, isn't even really in Sleepy Hollow. It's just a story that Brom tells, and that's the thing that's gone on to have the cultural impact, rather than Ichabod Crane, everyone's favourite glutton.
Well, there is a slightly weird element to this in that Brom says, I'm going to tell him this fable to scare him, but it's real, right?
It depends. In the original story, from my knowledge, please someone correct me if I'm wrong about this, after Ichabod leaves, he is chased off the road by a Headless Horseman. However, in the original story, it's heavily implied that it was Brom in disguise.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense, and is also way less interesting.
I think it's more interesting that this man, his romantic rival, was so wound up that he decided to dress up as a ghost and chase him off the road.
We've all done it, Liam. Don't be so proud. Once Brom has finished his song, Ichabod heads home and gets increasingly nervous, mishearing all sorts of different things, until, lo and behold, the Headless Horseman actually shows up. I'm going to say this, the Headless Horseman is genuinely badass. The animation on him is beautiful. They've gone for a really simple but effective colour scheme, so his horse is black, his body is purple, and he has the jack-o'-lantern as his head that he carries by his side. Visually, it's amazing, and the quality of animation on that far surpasses basically anything else we've seen in the package films. I think the last 10 minutes of this film are worth watching in a vacuum. That song leading into the Headless Horseman sequence are just very strong pieces of cinema.
Yeah, I've got to agree. I think if there's one thing you can take away from this, definitely look up the sequence with the Headless Horseman. If you have access to the whole film, whether you've got it on Disney Plus or any other service, just go to the last sort of 15-20 minutes and watch from there. It's pretty good and you've not missed anything up to that point.
And that's the adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. We get a very brief outro from Bing, and then it just ends. Honestly, I think it's the stronger of the two, but that's not saying much.
Definitely the stronger of the two. I like the framing device of talking about and comparing characters from either country. I feel that was added at a later date, because I think if they'd started with that, they would have chose better stories to adapt. If I'm asking the question, who's the greatest literary character, there's a lot more examples that come to mind rather than Mr. Toad and Ichabod Crane, two objectively terrible people.
Well, it's funny, when Bing is reflecting on which character he thinks might be the greatest from American literature, he specifically mentions both Pecos Bill and Johnny Appleseed.
Well, he's immediately wrong there. Wait, so do you think those were intended to be a package then? Because that would make so much more sense. Pecos Bill, Johnny Appleseed, and Ichabod Crane in one package film that I can then completely avoid.
Possibly, but I'm pretty sure the Sleepy Hollow adaptation was made after that, because they had The Wind in the Willows in production for quite a long time before they started working on Sleepy Hollow as something to pair it with. Originally, I think they were going to pair it with Bongo. So yeah, I think it's just Disney blowing its own trumpet.
So that's the adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. So Ben, any other thoughts on this film?
The only other interesting tidbit I've got to take away from it is a sequence that was very familiar to me, and it took me a moment to process it. During the battle for the deed of Toad Hall in The Wind in the Willows, there is a sequence where characters are back and forthing with this MacGuffin and stealing off each other and running away, and it is reused frame for frame during the sequence at the ancient ruins in The Jungle Book. The sequence where the monkeys and King Louie are trying to steal Mowgli off Bagheera and Baloo.
That's really interesting because actually, in Mickey and the Beanstalk, we have what I thought might be the first example of this, which is they use frame for frame the animation of the crows from Dumbo. So if you're not familiar, when Disney was trying to save money, a technique they often relied on was taking existing sketches and painting new cells over these so that you didn't have to then commit the resources of having an animator sketch out every frame that you were doing. So we're going to see this a lot over the next sort of 20 years of films or so. And yeah, I think the crows in Fun and Fancy Free might be the first example, but it's only a short one. That's a much more egregious example if it's the whole sequence.
And with that, we finish looking at the last of the two package films. Liam, is there anything else we need to discuss?
Before we decide whether or not either of these make the cut for Waly Gisnep's animated features, we just have to decide who the sexiest character in each of these films is.
Well, Fun and Fancy Free came first, so Liam, who is the sexiest character?
While I was watching it, I was worried I was going to have to pick the female bear. However, luckily, in Mickey and the Beanstalk, a sexy harp shows up. I'm not sure it's any better than a bear, but at least it's age appropriate, so I'm going to go for the sexy harp. And Ben, I think I know who you're going to choose, but who is the sexiest character in The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad?
It's Katrina.
Oh, I thought you were going to go for Toad.
No, he's awful. He's a friggin' liability. And with that, we come to the final question about these films. We unseal the vault, Liam produces the parchment and quill, and we ask ourselves, are either of these films worthy of making the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics? So far, only two films have been deemed worthy, that of Dumbo and Pinocchio, and Fantasia has made the sort of reserve list written on the back. Liam, would you put either of these films on Waly Gisnep's animated classics?
I don't even think it was worth pulling the parchment out of the vault.
My overall feeling on the package films is they have an average length of probably about an hour and 10, hour and 15 minutes. And over the 6 of them, there's maybe that much good content across them. If you edited all those down into the best bits, then maybe you'd have a case for it. But as stands, there's too much padding, the animation quality's too poor, and they just feel cheap.
Can you imagine if we hadn't split this up and we both had to watch 7 hours worth of this?
Sorry, I was just trying to imagine it, and it just made me very unhappy.
And with that, we're finally done with the package films. Is everything from this point an excellent, timeless classic? We're just going to have to see. Ben, what are we looking at next week?
Next week, we're looking at what was at least commercially a return to form for Disney, and that is the stone cold classic Cinderella.
I'm happy to say I'm looking forward to this, not only because it's not a package film, but from my recollection, I quite like this one, so we'll have to see how it goes.
Until then, this has been Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics. My name's Ben, and I've been joined once again by Liam. If you did enjoy this podcast, please do listen to all the other episodes. We're always looking for feedback and also suggestions of what to look at after we finish the Animated Classics. Admittedly, we've got a bit of a ways to go, but there's plenty more animated and or Disney films out there. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.
You can't reason with a headless man.